My name is Simone Carter, and I am 29 years old. 6 weeks ago, at my parents' dining table, my mother slid a folded index card across the tablecloth toward me. On it, in her neat church bulletin handwriting, was a number, $220,000. My sister sat beside her nodding like she'd co-signed the request in advance, which, as it turned out, she basically had. My brother-in-law leaned back in his chair with the specific comfort of a man who believes the outcome of a conversation before it starts. They wanted me to read that number, understand it as a family obligation, and quietly go get my checkbook. What none of them knew was that I had been keeping a record since I was 19 years old, in a navy blue notebook I never once mentioned to any of them. And that record had an ending they weren't going to like. If you've ever been the one who paid quietly while somebody else got the parade thrown in their honor, stay with me, because this one gets worse before it gets fair. Hit like if any part of this sounds familiar, subscribe if you want the rest of it, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. I read every one. Now let me take you back 10 years. To the summer, everything in my family got sorted into 2 piles, and I learned which pile I was in. I grew up on the 2nd floor of a narrow row house in a Baltimore neighborhood called Ferncrest, 4 blocks from the harbor smell, and 2 blocks from a church my mother served on the deacon board of for 11 years running. My father, Simone Carter, worked the cranes at the port for 34 years, same shift, same steel-toed boots resoled twice a year, same thermos of coffee his whole career. My mother, Renata, ran the house like a small, exacting country with a strict foreign policy toward anything that might embarrass her in front of the congregation. My older sister Bianca was 3 years ahead of me and, from what I could tell by the time I was 7, roughly 100 years ahead of me in the ledger of my mother's attention. When Bianca made the honor roll, there was a cake. When I made it, there was a nod and a reminder to take out the recycling. When Bianca turned 13, there was a bounce house in the church parking lot. When I turned 13, there was a box mix cake and my father slipping me a $10 bill under the table so my mother wouldn't see and ask where it came from. I don't say any of this looking for sympathy. I say it because it's the first entry in a pattern that took me another 16 years to fully understand. And because understanding patterns turned out to be the thing I was actually good at. There's a specific memory I keep coming back to from when I was 10. My mother hosted a Christmas Eve dinner every year for the church board. 20-some people crowded into a row house built for 6, and she spent 3 days beforehand polishing a set of silver candlesticks that had belonged to her own mother. Bianca, 12 going on 30, was allowed to sit at the adult table that year for the first time, in a dress my mother had bought new for the occasion. I was handed an apron and told I could help serve, since I was good with the little details, which even at 10 I understood to mean I was useful in the kitchen and decorative nowhere else. I didn't resent Bianca for that, not really. I resented the math of it, the way a family of 4 kept coming out uneven no matter how the numbers were run. My father noticed more than he ever said out loud back then. He'd slip me the good piece of pie when my mother wasn't looking, or drive me to the library on his one day off without telling her where we'd gone. He wasn't a rescuer. He was a man who'd decided a long time before I was born that keeping the peace in that house was worth more to him than making waves on my behalf, and he stuck to that decision with a kind of quiet, tired consistency for most of my childhood. I understood that about him even then, in the vague way kids understand things they don't yet have language for. My grandmother, Desmond's mother, used to mix a paste out of shea butter and crushed calendula for the eczema that ran on that side of the family, working from a recipe she'd learned from her own mother in a kitchen with no measuring cups at all, just years of feel. By the time I was 11, I was the one measuring it out for her, because I liked the precision of it in a way that seemed to skip a generation. 2 tablespoons here, a pinch there. Write down what worked and what didn't, because you will forget by winter, and the rash always came back worse if you guessed instead of checked. I kept a small spiral notebook just for that, dated entries and handwriting that got steadier every year, tracking which batch calmed the redness fastest and which one, made with a slightly different oil ratio, made the skin flare up worse instead. That was the first ledger I ever kept, technically, though it would be years before I understood it as the beginning of anything. The person who actually saw me during those years wasn't blood. Her name was Odessa Grant, and she ran a bakery on the corner of our block that had been there since before I was born. Miss Odessa didn't have children of her own, and she had opinions about most things, including the fact that I was too quiet for a house that loud. She fed me grilled cheese on Tuesdays after school while my mother was at deacon meetings. She let me sit behind her register and do the till because I liked adding up the drawer at closing more than she did. On my 16th birthday, when nobody at home mentioned it until 9 at night, Miss Odessa had already made me a lopsided lemon cake and written my name on it twice, in case the first one smudged. You count things because you're paying attention, she told me once, watching me recheck a stack of receipts for the third time. Don't let anybody tell you that's a flaw. I held on to that longer than I held on to most things people said to me growing up. The rupture, the one that actually set the terms of the next decade, happened the summer I turned 19. I had a college fund. My grandmother, on my mother's side, had started it when I was born, and by the time I graduated high school, it held $22,340, which I had mentally spent 40 different ways on formulation textbooks and a chemistry program 2 states over. That same summer, Bianca got engaged to a man named Corey Vance, a loan officer at the time, before he decided loan officer wasn't glamorous enough and became, in his own words, a private capital strategist. The wedding cost $61,500. I know the number because I asked for it directly, years later, and my mother told me without blinking, the way you'd read a price off a menu. When I went to withdraw my college fund that August, the account had $340 left in it. My mother sat me down at the same kitchen table where the index card would land a decade later and explained, in the calm voice she used when she'd already decided something was fine, that the family had needed to borrow against it for the wedding deposit, the venue, the flowers, and a few other things that came up. She told me I was young and resourceful and that I would figure out loans. Then she said the sentence that would follow me for the rest of my life. Family covers family, Simone. You'll understand that better once you have one of your own to cover. I didn't cry in front of her. I want to be clear that this wasn't strength, exactly. It was the first time I understood, with total clarity, that crying in that kitchen had never once changed the outcome, so there was no point spending the tears there. I went up to my room, took out a blank composition notebook I'd bought for a chemistry class, and wrote at the top of the first page, Item 1. $22,030.40. August 14, my tuition fund. Not asked, not repaid. I didn't know yet that I was starting a habit that would run for the next 10 years. I only knew I needed somewhere to put the number so it would stop rattling around loose in my chest. Let me take you through what came next the way I actually lived it, which is to say, one entry at a time, because that's the only way I ever made sense of it myself. Year 1 after the wedding, I took out $31,000 in student loans at an interest rate that felt like a tax on being the second daughter, and I enrolled anyway, because cosmetic chemistry had been the one thing that made my brain feel quiet since I was 11 years old mixing paste for my grandmother's arms. I worked the overnight stocking shift at a drugstore 3 nights a week and did lab work during the day. My mother called twice that first semester. Both times, she wanted to know if I could send anything home, because Bianca and Corey's first apartment needed a security deposit and things were tight. And 2, $1,200. October. Rent money I'd saved for my own apartment, wired to cover Bianca's security deposit instead, because my mother asked and I hadn't yet learned that no was a complete sentence. Miss Odessa mailed me a card every single month that year with a $20 bill folded inside it and a note that said the same 4 words each time, "Buy yourself something, dear." I still have every one of those cards in a shoebox. 41 of them. Over the years, I kept count. I never spent a single 20 on myself. I spent them on lab supplies, but I kept the cards. Year 2, I nearly dropped out. I'd had an allergic reaction to a preservative I was testing in an off-campus lab I'd rented time in, and I ended up in an emergency room at 2 in the morning with my throat swelling and a resident asking me who to call. I called my mother first. She didn't pick up. I called her 4 more times over the next hour. 6 rings each time, then voicemail. I called Bianca, nothing. The person who showed up, in her nightgown and a church coat thrown over it, having driven 40 minutes with her hazards on the whole way, was Miss Odessa. She sat with me until 6 in the morning and then drove me back to my dorm and made me eat a plate of eggs before she'd leave. Item 3, $0, but I wrote it down anyway, because some entries in that ledger were never about money. 5 calls, 2 family members, 0 answers. I graduated with a formulation science degree and a mountain of debt, and I moved into a 500-square-foot apartment above a dry cleaner, where the whole place smelled faintly of solvent no matter how many candles I burned. I started mixing small batches of a calendula and shea salve, the same base recipe my grandmother taught me, refined with what I'd actually learned in school, and I sold it out of a cardboard box at a Saturday market for $4 a jar. Miss Odessa let me set up a card table outside her bakery for free every weekend for 2 years. She told her regulars I was the smart one on the block, which was generous, considering half of them had watched me grow up right there on her stoop. The early years of building anything real out of a 500-square-foot apartment are mostly just tedium, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. I spent whole weekends testing preservative ratios that failed, batches that separated after 3 days on a shelf, labels that peeled the first time they touched a damp bathroom counter. I applied for a small business loan the winter I turned 23, walked into 3 separate banks with a business plan I'd written and rewritten 9 times, and was turned down by all 3, twice for lack of collateral, and once, more bluntly, because the loan officer told me the skincare market was already saturated by bigger players and suggested I consider it a hobby I kept alongside a more stable job. I still remember his exact phrasing, because I wrote it down that same afternoon, right underneath item 4. Miss Odessa lent me $3,200 out of her own bakery savings that same month. No paperwork, no interest, just a handshake and a look that told me she expected to see it back someday and wasn't worried about when. Year 3 brought the loan I didn't understand until years after I'd signed it. My mother called that spring, said she needed my help with some paperwork for a small home improvement loan, something about redoing the kitchen before Bianca's baby shower, since the house would be full of her friends from the sorority. I was 22, still new to reading financial documents critically, still the kind of daughter who trusted that her own mother would tell her the truth about what she was signing. I co-signed a personal loan for $38,700. I found out 2 years later when a lender pulled my credit for a small business loan I was applying for, and I saw a payment history full of 30-day late marks I hadn't made on an account I barely remembered signing. I still remember standing in the back of the venue at Bianca's wedding, in a bridesmaid dress that cost more than a month of my grocery budget at the time, watching my mother beam at a room full of white orchids she'd fought the florist over for an extra hour on the phone. Somebody's cousin leaned over to me during the reception and said, kindly enough, "Your family really knows how to put on an event." I remember smiling and saying thank you, and I remember thinking very clearly, in the specific way you think a thing you'll carry for years, that I was standing inside the exact number I'd just watched disappear from my own account 3 weeks earlier. Nobody in that room could have known that. I wasn't performing bitterness at my own sister's wedding. I was just quietly doing math nobody else at the table was doing, which turned out to be something I would end up doing for the next 10 years. Item 4. 38,700 co-signed, my credit damaged for the better part of 3 years, discovered by accident, never disclosed by the person who asked me to sign it. That was the year the ledger stopped being a place I put my hurt feelings and became something closer to a professional habit. I started keeping it the way I'd been trained to keep a lab notebook, dated entries, specific amounts, no editorializing, because a lab notebook that includes your feelings about the experiment is a lab notebook nobody can trust later. I wasn't building a case against my family. I want to say that clearly because it matters and because I said it to myself out loud more than once during those years. I was keeping records the way you keep records about anything you might need to understand later and can't yet see the whole shape of. If any part of this is landing with you the way it landed with me back then, the quiet math of who shows up and who doesn't, comment below and tell me what your ledger would say if you kept one. I'll read them. Subscribe too if this story is earning it, because the accounting only gets more specific from here. Year 4. My little jar business got a name. I called it Carter and Bloom, half after my father's last name, and half because the calendula flower is where the whole thing started. I rented a 600-square-foot commercial kitchen space 2 nights a week to make batches large enough for wholesale, and I pitched the line to 14 small boutiques before the 15th said yes, and put 4 dozen jars on a shelf in a shop that smelled like eucalyptus and good decisions. I remember standing in that shop for 11 minutes after I dropped the delivery off, just watching the jars sit there on the shelf like they belonged somewhere. I told my family about the boutique placement at a Sunday dinner. My mother asked whether it was a real store or one of those little shops. My father asked how the port was doing, out of habit, before catching himself and asking about my kitchen instead, which was more than my mother managed. Bianca, 7 months pregnant with her first, asked whether I could do the favors for her baby shower, since you're already making the little jars anyway. I said yes. I always said yes back then. I made 90 custom favor jars for free and delivered them myself, and nobody mentioned the boutique placement again for the rest of that visit. Item 5. 90 jars, roughly 540 in materials, and 11 hours of labor, donated. The favor jars are still, to this day, the only Carter and Bloom product my mother has ever handed to another person with something like pride in her voice. She just never once mentioned that I made them. Toward the tail end of year 4, once I understood what the cosign loan had actually cost me, I sat down with the credit counselor for the first time in my life, a woman at a nonprofit clinic who spent 90 minutes with me for free, walking through my report line by line and showing me exactly which accounts weren't mine to worry about and which ones I now had to manage myself. She was the one who first suggested I start keeping a written record of any financial requests from family going forward, not to be paranoid, she said, just so you can see the shape of the pattern instead of feeling it. I didn't tell her I already had a Navy notebook doing exactly that. I just nodded and thanked her. and went home and added a new column to the ledger that night, a running total updated at the bottom of every entry so I would never again have to add the whole thing up in my head under pressure. Year 5, my father was quietly laid off from the port for 8 months during a slow contract cycle, and the house went through a stretch where money was thin enough that my mother stopped hosting the big Sunday dinners for a while. Nobody called to tell me. I found out from a cousin at a funeral. When I asked my mother about it directly, she said, with real irritation in her voice, that she didn't want to worry me while I was busy with my little business. I sent them $2,400 that month anyway, quietly, through an envelope I mailed instead of handing over in person, because handing it over in person always turned into a conversation about how the business must be doing better than I let on. It was the same year Corey's first venture, a logistics software company he'd raised money for using a pitch deck that bore a suspicious resemblance to a supply chain tracking tool I'd built myself for batch inventory and shown him once at a family dinner, folded after 6 months. He told everyone the market had shifted. I never brought up the pitch deck. I wrote it down instead. Item 6. One idea, unattributed. No dollar figure attached, because some thefts don't come with a receipt. Year 6 was the year Miss Odessa's knees finally gave out on the bakery's concrete floor after 4 decades, and she sold the shop to a younger couple who wanted to turn it into a juice bar. She cried packing up the ovens, and I was the one who drove the moving truck, because nobody else in my life had a reason to clear a schedule for her. She moved into a small apartment 3 blocks from mine, and we started a standing Sunday phone call at 7 in the evening that has not been missed by either of us in 4 years. Not once, I've counted. That same year, Carter and Bloom crossed 6 figures in annual revenue for the first time, and I finally moved my production into a proper leased facility with real equipment instead of borrowed kitchen time. My mother's response when I mentioned the new facility at Thanksgiving was to ask whether I was still doing the little skincare thing in front of her sorority sisters, in a tone that made it very clear she wanted them to hear the word little. If you've ever built something real while the people closest to you kept describing it as a phase, comment below and tell me what word they used on you. Mine was little. I heard it for almost a decade before the number attached to my name got big enough that the word finally changed. Somewhere between year 6 and year 7, my mother started introducing me at church functions as my daughter who does the skincare thing, which I noticed only because I'd spent years cataloging exactly how she introduced Bianca, always by full title, my daughter Bianca, who's married to a wonderful young man in finance. Corey had been unemployed for 4 of the 6 months preceding that particular introduction. I wrote it down anyway, because the ledger wasn't only for money. Some entries in that notebook exist purely to keep me honest with myself about what was actually being said in that house, since I'd learned by then how easily a warm tone could disguise a cold sentence if I wasn't paying close enough attention. Year 7, Bianca and Corey bought a house in a neighborhood well outside what either of their incomes, as far as I understood them, should have supported. 5 bedrooms, a circular driveway, the kind of listing photo that gets shared around a family group chat with 3 separate exclamation points. My mother mentioned more than once how proud she was of the kind of life Bianca built for herself and hosted a small housewarming where she toasted Corey specifically for knowing how to provide. I sat through that toast holding a glass of sparkling cider and doing the math in my head on how a man between ventures, by his own admission at that same party, had managed a down payment that size. I didn't ask the question out loud. I wrote it down instead next to a question mark, because I didn't yet have the answer, and the ledger has always allowed for entries I couldn't fully explain yet. I did not point out, that year, that I had quietly wired the 2 of them $2,400 more myself, in 2 separate favors neither ever repaid, or that my own apartment was still above a dry cleaner while theirs had a circular driveway. I wrote both amounts down instead. That was the year the ledger passed 40 entries. Year 8, my formulas started getting real attention. A regional retail chain picked up 3 products for a 50-store rollout, which meant renegotiating my manufacturing contracts, hiring my first full-time employee, a young woman named Priya who still runs my quality control lab today, and spending 11 straight nights redoing packaging artwork because the chain's compliance department rejected my first submission over a labeling technicality nobody had warned me about. A trade publication did a small feature on independent skincare founders that same season and put my face in it, next to 2 women with much larger followings and much larger seed rounds, under a headline about the next generation of clean beauty. I bought 6 copies of that issue and kept one, still in its plastic wrap, in a drawer in my office. My mother saw the article because someone from her church sent it to her, not because I told her about it. Her only comment, delivered over the phone in a voice I remember exactly because it was so flat, was, "That's a nice picture of you. You should smile more in photos." I waited, on that call, for a full 30 seconds of silence after she said it, giving her every chance to add something else. He didn't. I hung up, opened the ledger, and wrote the whole exchange down word for word, because by then I'd learned that the things my mother didn't say were usually more informative than the things she did. I want to pause on something here, because it matters to how the rest of this story goes. Through every single one of those years, I never stopped answering the family's calls. I never once said no to my father when he needed a ride, or to Bianca when she needed a babysitter, or even to my mother when the asks were small. I wasn't building toward some future confrontation. I was a daughter and a sister who loved her family and kept getting handed proof, on a rolling basis, that the feeling wasn't running both directions at the same intensity. Documenting it didn't start as strategy. It started as the only way I had, as a formulator, to keep from losing my own sense of what was actually happening to me. There was a stretch, right around year 8.5, when I almost stopped keeping the ledger entirely, not because things had gotten better, but because I'd started to wonder if writing it all down was making me colder than I wanted to be. I asked Miss Odessa about it, one Sunday call, whether she thought I was turning into someone who couldn't just love her family without keeping score. She was quiet for a moment, longer than her usual pauses, and then she said something I still think about. "You're not keeping score, baby. A scorekeeper wants to win. You're keeping a batch record. You just want to know what actually happened so you can stop guessing about your own life." I kept the ledger after that call. I never doubted the habit again. That same stretch, my father's hours got cut at the port during a slow contract renewal. The second time in 3 years his income had wobbled, and I quietly covered 2 mortgage payments, $180.50 each, without telling anyone but him, because I didn't want it turning into another line item my mother could later describe at a family dinner as something the whole family had pulled together to manage. He paid me back $400 of it over the following year, in small increments, always apologizing for the slowness, always more grateful than the situation should have required from a daughter who genuinely didn't mind helping her own father. That's the difference, if you're keeping track of the shape of this story. I didn't resent every dollar that left my account. I resented the dollars that left quietly while somebody else's dollars arrived with a toast. Somewhere in there, I noticed my mother had started using the phrase, "family covers family," for almost anything she wanted from me, the way a chord progression gets reused across a dozen different songs until you stop hearing the individual notes. She used it when she wanted me to cover Bianca's caterer deposit the year the wedding budget ran over. She used it again when Corey needed a reference for an apartment application after his credit had already taken a hit from his first failed venture. She used it a third time, more quietly, the year my father's hours got cut, though notably never once when I was the one who needed something covered. I started noticing the pattern the way I noticed patterns in a bad batch, not from any single instance, but from watching the same failure recur under slightly different conditions until the underlying cause became obvious. Year 9 is the year everything changed, though none of us knew it yet at the time. A mid-sized cosmetics group called Verena Beauty Collective had been quietly acquiring small independent skincare lines for 2 years, folding them into their portfolio while keeping the original founders on as creative leads. Their acquisitions team reached out to me in February through a mutual contact after seeing the retail rollout numbers. The conversation moved slowly and carefully, the way real deals do, through 11 months of due diligence, 3 term sheet drafts, and 1 very long call with my own attorney about deal structure. I told exactly 2 people while it was happening, my attorney and Miss Odessa, over our Sunday call, in a voice low enough that I made her promise twice not to repeat it. The due diligence process alone took most of that year. Verena's team requested 3 years of full financial statements, batch production records going back to my first commercial kitchen lease, ingredient sourcing documentation for every product in the line, and 2 separate rounds of lab testing on my formulas at their own facility in North Carolina, none of which I could rush and all of which I handled myself late at night after full production days because I didn't trust anyone else yet to represent 10 years of work accurately to a room full of strangers. Priya covered the floor during the days I had to be on calls with their legal team. I remember one specific Tuesday in July when I was on the phone with their acquisitions counsel for 4 hours straight, walking through preservative stability data line by line, and I hung up afterward and sat on my office floor for a while, not crying exactly, just letting the size of what was actually happening settle into my body before I had to go back out and check the afternoon's fill line. I did not tell my family. Not because I was hiding a secret for the joy of it, but because I had, by then, 10 years of very specific data suggesting that the moment they learned a real number was attached to my name, the conversation in that house would stop being about me and start being about the number. I was right. I just didn't yet know how right or how they'd find out. The deal closed the second week of October. $9.4 million split between a cash payment and a smaller retained equity stake in the parent company, with me staying on as creative director of the line I'd built. My attorney handled the paperwork discreetly. I told exactly no one outside my two people, and I planned, honestly, to tell my family quietly and simply at some point before the holidays, on my own terms, in my own way. They found out 3 weeks before I'd planned to tell them, and they found out the way families like mine always seem to find things out, sideways, through someone who wasn't supposed to be talking. My cousin Tasha works as a paralegal at a firm 2 floors down from my attorney's office in the same downtown building, and she'd overheard, entirely by accident, a conversation between 2 associates about the Carter and Bloom deal while waiting for an elevator. Tasha, who has never once in her life been able to keep a piece of gossip in her mouth for longer than an hour, texted her sister about it that same afternoon. Her sister is in a family group chat with my mother. That chat has 14 members, including, apparently, someone who doesn't mute notifications well, because a screenshot from inside that chat ended up forwarded to me by accident 3 days later by Tasha herself, who meant to send it to a completely different conversation and only realized her mistake after I'd already read it twice. I want to describe exactly what was in it because it's the moment this story actually turns. My mother had written, to the group, that she'd heard from a reliable source, that I had come into some real money from selling my little business, and that she thought it was time the family had an honest conversation about what Simone owes this house, considering everything this family has sacrificed for her. Bianca had responded within 4 minutes, "Make a list, Mom. Be specific. She's a numbers person now, she'll respect a real number more than a feeling." My mother had replied with a laughing emoji and the words, "You're right, baby. I'll draft something this week." I sat with my phone in my hand for what I counted afterward as roughly 90 seconds, not moving. Then I did what I have done with every hard piece of information in my life since I was 19 years old. I opened the Navy ledger, and I wrote it down. Item 41, 1 screenshot. My own mother, planning a specific dollar figure to request from me 3 weeks before she planned to speak to me at all. I called my attorney the next morning, not to attack anyone, but to confirm that the acquisition proceeds and my retained equity were already properly held inside the trust structure we'd set up during the deal, well outside the reach of anything short of me choosing, of my own free will, to write a check. His name is Marcus Webb, and he's handled my contracts since the first wholesale deal I ever signed, back when the only thing at stake was 4 dozen jars on a boutique shelf. He pulled up the trust documents while I was on the phone with him and walked me through it line by line. The corpus was fully funded, the distribution terms required my signature and mine alone, and nothing short of a court order could compel a payout to a third party. "You're protected," he told me. "Nobody can pressure their way into this account. The only door in is the one you open yourself." He also, gently, asked whether I wanted to talk to someone about the family situation itself, not just the paperwork. I told him I already had someone. I called Miss Odessa that same evening and read her the screenshot out loud, word for word, the way I'd read it to myself the first 3 times. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped, and then she said the only thing she's ever said to me about my family that came close to bitterness. "They didn't ask what you built, Simone. They asked what it's worth to them." I sat with that sentence for most of that week. It clarified something I'd been circling for 10 years without quite landing on. The family hadn't ever really been indifferent to my life. They'd been waiting, patiently and without much self-awareness about it, for my life to become a resource they could draw on. The indifference was never really indifference. It was more like a line of credit nobody had told me they were extending against my future. I decided, sitting in my apartment that night with the ledger open on my lap, that I was done being ambushed at other people's tables. If this conversation was going to happen, it was going to happen on ground I chose, on a schedule I set, with everything I needed already in the room. I called my mother the following Sunday and told her I wanted to have everyone over for dinner the next weekend, at a space I'd rent for the occasion, to talk about some things I'd been wanting to share. She sounded delighted. I imagine she thought I was calling a family meeting to announce exactly how I planned to spend the money on them. I chose the space deliberately, the old bakery storefront on the corner of our old block, the one that used to be Miss Odessa's, now empty between tenants after the juice bar folded. The current owner, a man who'd bought the building as an investment and barely used it, rented it to me for one evening without asking questions. I had the old ovens cleaned because they were still there, unused, gathering dust behind the counter, and for one night I wanted my family standing in the exact room where the only unconditional kindness of my childhood had actually lived. I set 6 places. My father, my mother, Bianca, Corey, myself, and one for Miss Odessa, who I asked to come and sit quietly, whether or not she said a single word all night. They arrived at 6:15, my mother, in a dress I recognized from a catalog I'd seen her circle a page in months earlier, Bianca already glancing around the room like she was pricing the real estate. Corey shook my hand a beat too long, the way men do when they've decided in advance that a handshake is a negotiation tactic. My father hugged me the way he always did, one arm quick, like he was worried about taking up too much space in it. We sat. Miss Odessa took the seat closest to the door and said almost nothing for the first 20 minutes, which was exactly what I'd asked of her. My mother didn't wait for dinner to be served before she brought out the folded index card. She slid it across the table the way she probably practiced doing it and said, in a warm voice that had clearly been rehearsed to sound spontaneous, "We wanted to talk to you about family, baby." About what family does for each other. I unfolded the card. 220,000, written in her handwriting, no explanation attached, as though the number alone should have been argument enough. "What's this for?" I asked. "Flat?" Not a question so much as a request for the itemization I already suspected didn't exist as cleanly as she thought it did. "Bianca and Corey are behind on the house," my mother said. "Corey's had some setbacks in his investments. And your father and I have some obligations of our own we've been carrying quietly, because we didn't want to burden you while you were building your little company. Family covers family, Simone. You know that." There it was. The same 4 words from the kitchen table a decade earlier, delivered with the same warm certainty, as though repetition alone had made them true. "I do know that," I said. "I've known it since I was 19. I reached into my bag and set the navy ledger on the table, closed, and rested my hand flat on top of it for a moment before I opened it. "I'd like to read you something if that's all right. I've been keeping this a long time." Corey let out a short laugh, the kind meant to signal to the room that whatever was about to happen didn't concern him. "What is that, your diary?" "It's a record," I said. "The way I keep records on my formulas. Aided, measured. I don't guess at things I can write down instead." I opened to item 1 and read it exactly as I'd written it a decade before. 22,340. August 14th, my tuition fund, not asked, not repaid. My mother's face didn't move much, but her hand found the edge of the table. "That was a family decision," she said. "Bianca's wedding mattered to this family. It mattered $61,500 worth," I said. "I have that number too, if you'd like me to read it next to mine." I moved through the entries the way I'd have presented a quarterly cost report at work, because that's genuinely the only register I had for this conversation that didn't feel like it would collapse into something I couldn't control. Item 2, the rent money wired for Bianca's security deposit. Item 3, 5 calls to the hospital, 2 family members, 0 answers. Corey shifted in his seat at that one, glancing toward Bianca, who kept her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. "This is ridiculous," Bianca said, finding her voice for the first time that evening. "You're really going to sit here and read us a diary like we're on trial?" "It's not a trial," I said. "There's no verdict here. I'm not asking a judge to make you do anything. I'm just telling you what happened, in order, because you asked me for $220,000 tonight and I think you're owed an honest answer about why that number means something different to me than it does to you." I turned the page. 5. 90 favor jars, hand-poured, delivered free for your baby shower. Item 6 is Corey's, we'll get to that one in a minute. Item 9, $2,400, wired the year Dad was laid off, because nobody called to tell me the house was struggling until I heard it at a funeral. My father flinched slightly at that one, the first visible reaction he'd had all night. Item 4 is the one that actually cracked the room open. I read the exact date my mother had asked me to co-sign paperwork for the kitchen, and the actual amount, $38,700, and the 3 years of damage credit that followed, discovered by accident and never once disclosed. "You knew what you were asking me to sign," I said, looking at her directly. "I was 22. I trusted you. That's the part that actually cost me something, not the money." My mother's composure, which had held through everything so far with the practiced calm of a woman used to controlling every room she entered, finally slipped. It lasted, by my count, about 4 seconds. "I was scared," she said, and her voice cracked in a way I had genuinely never heard it crack before, not once in 29 years. "I was scared of what it would look like if we didn't have anything to show for ourselves while you were building something out of nothing. I didn't know how else to keep this family looking like it was still standing." 4 seconds. Then, just as fast as it came, she pulled it back in, straightened her spine, and added, "But that doesn't change what you owe this family, Simone. We're still your parents." Corey, sensing an opening the way he always seemed to sense openings that had nothing to do with him, leaned forward. "Look, at the end of the day, this is about the family unit staying intact. 9.4 million is a lot of leverage to be sitting on while people who raised you are drowning." I turned to him for the first time all night. "Let's talk about item 6, I said. The logistics software company, the pitch deck you raised money on? I showed you the batch inventory tool I built for my own kitchen at a Sunday dinner 4 years before you filed for that company. You never once mentioned where the idea for the tracking dashboard came from when you pitched it to investors. Corey's jaw tightened, and for the first time that night he had nothing rehearsed to say. Bianca turned to look at him slowly, and I watched something shift behind her eyes that had nothing to do with me. Is that true? She asked him. Quiet. Not performing for anyone. It wasn't like that, Corey said, which is what people say when it was, in fact, exactly like that. I didn't press it further. It wasn't my grievance to prosecute on Bianca's behalf, and this genre of confrontation only works if I stay in my own lane, so I closed that thread and turned the last page. Item 41, I said, and I read them the screenshot, word for word, the way Tasha had accidentally sent it to me. Renata saying she'd heard I'd come into real money. Bianca telling her to make a list because I was a numbers person now. My mother agreeing to draft something that week. The room went silent long enough that I counted 17 seconds before anyone spoke. You went through my messages, my mother finally said, which was, of everything she could have said in that moment, the thing that told me exactly how little had actually changed. I didn't go through anything, I said. Somebody sent it to the wrong chat. I read it once, and I understood, finally, why nobody had called me in 3 weeks except to schedule this dinner. My father had not said a single word since we sat down. He'd been staring at the closed ovens behind the counter, the same ones Miss Odessa used to run, for most of the conversation. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. I should have called you the night you were in that emergency room, he said. I remember your mother telling me about it after the fact. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. That was a lie, I told myself, so I wouldn't have to admit I was scared of your mother's temper more than I cared about showing up for you. He looked at me directly, which he almost never did. I'm not going to pretend that's enough. I know it isn't, but I wanted you to hear me say it out loud in front of everyone instead of just to you quietly later where it wouldn't cost me anything. It was the only thing said at that table all evening that didn't ask me for something. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that, because I know some part of every person watching this expects the daughter to finally break at the one moment somebody finally says something true. I didn't break because I had spent 10 years learning that my own composure was the one thing in that house nobody could take a loan against. I'm not paying the $220,000, I said. I'm not buying Bianca and Corey a house. I already spoke with my attorney before tonight, and everything I earned from this deal sits in a trust that isn't mine to casually hand over even if I wanted to, which I don't. What I will do is have my attorney formally settle the outstanding balance on the loan you co-signed me into without my full understanding, so it stops following my credit around. Not as a gift to you. As the closing of an account that should never have been opened in my name to begin with. My mother opened her mouth to argue the number again, out of what I genuinely believe was reflex more than calculation at that point, and I held up a hand, not sharply, just enough to finish. Family covers family, I said. You taught me that sentence when I was 19 years old, standing in a kitchen where $340 was all that was left of my tuition fund. I'm going to use it exactly the way you meant it tonight. Nobody at this table asked me one time in 10 years whether I needed covering. Not when I was in an emergency room at 2 a.m. Not when my father lost his job for 8 months, not once. So I'm not interested in adopting the phrase, now that the number finally interests you. Miss Odessa, who had not said a word the entire evening, reached over at that moment and put her hand flat on top of mine, on top of the ledger, and left it there. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her showing up, sitting quietly in a room she used to run herself, was the only argument in the room I actually needed backing me up. Bianca finally spoke, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. So that's it? You're just done with us? I'm done paying to stay in the room, I said. There's a difference. She looked down at her hands for a moment, and when she looked back up, something in her face had shifted from the entitlement she'd walked in with to something closer to actual grief. I didn't know about the loan, she said quietly. Ooh, the co-signing thing. I want you to know, I didn't know about that one. I believe you, I said, and I meant it. But you knew about the wedding fund, and you never once asked where the money came from. At some point, not asking becomes its own kind of knowing. She didn't argue with that. It was, of everything said that night, the closest thing to an honest exchange the two of us managed, and I've held on to it since, not as a resolution, but as a small, real thread I might someday decide to pull on. My mother, watching that exchange, seemed to sense the room had moved past the number on her index card entirely, and she made one last attempt to drag it back. So you're telling this whole family no, she said. After everything. I'm telling you, no, I said. I already told your husband I'd have my attorney close out the loan account in my name, which is a courtesy, not an obligation, and I'm doing it because it's the right thing to close, not because you asked for it tonight. Everything else stays exactly where it is. I want to tell you what actually happened in the 8 months since that dinner, because the coda to this kind of story is usually more honest than the confrontation itself. My mother has not called. She sent one text, 4 days later, that read, "I hope you're happy with how you humiliated your family in front of that woman, and nothing since." I don't expect that to change, and I've stopped waiting for it to. That's not bitterness. It's just an accurate reading of a decade of data. Bianca and Corey separated 3 months after that dinner. I didn't ask for details, and Bianca hasn't offered them, though she did send me a single text in February that just said, "I found out some other things about him after you brought up the software company. I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner. I haven't written back yet. I might, eventually. I'm not in a hurry to decide that for either of us." My father calls every other Sunday now, 30 minutes after Miss Odessa and I finish our own standing call, as though he waited until he was sure he wasn't interrupting anything. The conversations are small. He asks about the new product line. He tells me about a crane operator he trained 20 years ago who just retired. 2 months ago he asked if he could come by the production facility sometime just to see it, not to be given anything, just to see what I'd built. I told him he could come in the spring, once the new equipment installation settled, and I meant it as a real invitation and not a polite delay. He came on a Tuesday in April, in his good coat, and stood in the middle of the production floor for a long time without saying much, watching the fill line cap 400 jars an hour. He asked me to explain the batch numbering system stamped on the bottom of each jar, the same habit I'd started at 11 measuring shea butter for my grandmother, and when I told him each code meant I could trace any single jar back to the exact day and the exact hands that made it, he nodded slowly and said, "That's good practice." That's how we ran the cranes too. Everything logged so nobody has to guess later who did what. It was the closest he's come to telling me he sees where I get it from. I let it sit there without pushing him to say more. Some repairs move at the pace of a Tuesday afternoon, and I've learned not to rush them past what they can hold. I still have Sunday dinner, every week, at 7, though it's at my apartment now instead of a borrowed bakery. Miss Odessa comes when her knees allow it, and when they don't, I bring the dinner to her instead, and we eat at her small kitchen table with the television turned to a game show neither of us actually watches. 2 months ago, I used part of the acquisition proceeds to start a small grant, unglamorous and quiet, that gives first-year funding to young formulators from neighborhoods like mine who can't get a bank to take their kitchen table chemistry seriously. I named it after her corner bakery. The first recipient is a 20-year-old chemistry student 2 blocks from where I grew up, working on a scalp treatment for textured hair using a formula her own grandmother taught her, and when I handed her the check I recognized the exact look on her face that I must have worn the day Miss Odessa handed me $3,200 with nothing but a handshake attached to it. She cried when I told her the grant's name. Miss Odessa cried too when I told her, which she'd deny if you asked her about it directly. Bianca and I talk occasionally now, carefully, the way 2 people talk when they're both aware a bridge got scorched and are deciding, slowly, how much of it is actually rebuildable. She moved into a smaller apartment across town after the separation finalized, closer to her kids' school, and she's working front of house at a restaurant downtown, which I know only because a mutual friend mentioned it, not because she told me herself. I don't know yet what our relationship becomes. I've stopped needing to know on any particular timeline. The Navy ledger still sits on a shelf in my office, next to a framed photo of Miss Odessa's old bakery sign, the one the new owners took down when they gutted the storefront and that I asked to keep. The running total at the bottom of the last page still reads the same number. It read the night of that dinner, unchanged since. I haven't added an entry to it in 8 months, which is its own kind of ending, and honestly, the first one in this whole story that didn't cost me anything to arrive at. That's my story. 10 years, 42 entries, 1 Navy notebook, and a number on an index card that my own mother thought would be the thing that finally made me useful to her. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this, it's that you're allowed to keep your own records, even when nobody else in your family is keeping theirs honestly. Documenting what actually happened to you isn't bitterness. It's just the only defense some of us are ever handed, and it's enough, in the end, to walk into any room and tell the truth without raising your voice. I think a lot of people who hear a story like this expect the ending to be a clean one, where the mother finally sees the daughter clearly and everyone gathers around one table again. That's not what happened here, and I've stopped waiting for it to. Some doors close for good reasons, and staying honest about which ones are actually closed instead of leaving them cracked open out of guilt turned out to be its own kind of peace. My father is learning, slowly, at the pace of a Tuesday afternoon visit to a production floor. My mother isn't, and I've made my peace with the fact that she may never choose to. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I don't need them to resolve into a single tidy feeling anymore. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments what your own ledger would say, and hit subscribe if you want more stories like this one. I'll see you in the next one.